It's Canonically Crumb, the only show that explores the comics and characters of the Crummy-verse. In the summer of 1989, when I was a lad of but 6 years old, we were visiting family in Windsor, Ontario, when I saw something that would change the course of my life forever. While shopping at a Zellers, of all places. It was the cover of Mad Magazine number 289, and it blew my fucking mind. I couldn't read yet, so I didn't have any context really for what I was seeing. But I knew who Batman was, and I knew that was Superman's crest, not Batman's. What the hell? And then there was that face, with his idiotic, gap-toothed grin. Who could it be? It didn't occur to me to ask my grandmother to buy it for me, and she almost certainly would have. I didn't know that it was something that a kid could have. So we left, but that stupid face, it haunted me. There was just something about it. Luckily, I wasn't haunted for long, because later that evening, we visited my cousin, who was a couple years older than me, and already a mad reader. And that night, she initiated me into the Mad Magazine Mystery School. She put a name to that face, Alfred E. Newman. And she showed me how he appeared on every cover. Nearly. She showed me the fold-in on the inside back cover, Spy vs. Spy, the little pictures hidden in the margins, and Don Martin's zany characters with their huge chins and hinging feet and wacky sound effects. I bought the very next issue, and the next one, and the next one. I was hooked, continuing to buy every issue of Mad I could get my hands on. In my teen years, I gradually moved away from Mad and started buying heavy metal. Something about that magazine just appealed to me more at 13, 14 years old. I'm not sure what exactly, but my interest in Mad didn't disappear. It became more scholarly. I read Completely Mad by Maria Radelbach, and The Mad World of William M. Gaines by Frank Jacobs. And I became aware of the EC comic book, Tales Calculated to Drive You Mad, which had preceded the magazine in the 1950s. And once again, my young mind was blown. It was violent, lurid, transgressive, and frankly shocking. It challenged every preconceived notion I held about the comics medium, and it pushed its limits to the point of absurdity. And it was dripping with chicken fat. Basically, it was genius. And it was a kind of genius that was missing from the Mad that I grew up with in the early 90s, and the Mad that I was published in the late 2010s. And that genius is the subject of today's episode. Canonically Crumb number 11, Ode to Harvey Kurtzman. As always, we need to acknowledge that, for our purposes, Robert Crumb's canon includes The Big Yum Yum Book, The Complete Crumb, The Weirdo Years, Zap, Hup, Mystic Funnies, and a bit of dirty laundry. Ode to Harvey Kurtzman, spelt Kurtz with the little man, which is how Harvey Kurtzman often signed his name, like E.C. Segar, who signed his name with a cigar, or Duck Edwing, who signed with a duck, or perhaps even derivatively, Al Feldstein, is a sort of love letter by Crumb to the man who invented Mad Magazine. It was originally published as one of 3 introductions to the somewhat reviled book, Harvey Kurtzman's Strange Adventures, from Epic Comics in 1990. The book's poor reputation, I think, is owing to a few factors. For one, it was promised to be a new work by celebrated comics veteran Harvey Kurtzman, working with some of the top talent of the day. There was even going to be a leather-bound edition.
Yeah, Harvey's working with some of the best artists around right now. He's got William Stout, he's got Dave Gibbons, Robert Crumb,
David Gibbons, Harvey Kurtzman.
All the hot new guys.
But ultimately, it didn't live up to the hype. There's no overarching theme to the book, and Harvey was getting a little long in the tooth. If they did a leather-bound version, I haven't seen it. But there is some really nice art by great artists, and it's cool to see Harvey's layouts printed at the end. The first thing you notice about Ode to Harvey Kurtzman is that Crumb has adapted his style subtly, or perhaps not too subtly, to affect a Kurtzman-esque vibe. Not unlike the Clausian flourishes that he would add to his style in the comic I've Had It, from Zap number 14, which we covered in episode number 6, The Zap Files, Rashomon, at Terry Zwigoff's. He opts for the 9-panel layout, which Kurtzman often favored. He's given himself the iconic Kurtzman proportions, complete with noodle legs and floppy bean feet. He just kinda captures that Kurtzman bop. You dig? The story opens in 1952 with 9-year-old Bobby Crumb encountering the first issue of EC Comics' new satirical comic book, Tales Calculated to Drive You Mad. Little Bobby is utterly baffled by what he's looking at, reading, "It's Melvin," and saying, "I'm not ready for this." And the narration states that it made a deep impression. Some of the other comic books on the shelf include EC titles such as Tales from the Crypt, Weird Fantasy, The Haunt of Fear, and Frontline Combat, which was one of Harvey Kurtzman's war books. There's also an issue of Witches' Tales by Harvey Comics, no relation. 2 of the books just say the word crime and terror, which could be any number of books from the period, and interestingly, both are words that would be regulated and banned on comic covers by the Comics Code Authority only a few years later. And finally, this book that just says duck, which, funny enough, was another popular genre at the time. The name Melvin was a recurring gag in Mad, and the iconic cover to issue number 1 features this petrified couple in a typical haunted house. They're bathed in light spilling from a doorway out of frame. "That thing! That horrible slithering blob coming towards us! What is it?" they scream, as a cyclopean shadow lumbers towards them. Then, this goofy-ass kid says, "It's Melvin." In the next panel, set about a year and a half later, 10-year-old Robert Crumb encounters Mad once again, and it changes the way he sees the world forever. This time, it's Mad number 11, and Crumb is completely shocked by the issue's parody cover, made to look like Life magazine, an institution in its day. And Mad would parody the appearance of other kinds of books as well over the next year. Also, Crumb doesn't mention it, but I gotta imagine that this grotesque Basil Wolverton drawing on the cover must have had an impact as well. Having previously been known for doing weird sci-fi and horror comics, as well as humorous shorts like Scoop Scuttle and Mystic Moot, Bing Bang Buster, and Flat Flip Flop the Flying Flash, Basil Wolverton came to national fame for winning a contest to draw Lena the Hyena, the Lil Abner character so ugly that Al Cap never showed her face in the comic. The contest was judged by Salvador Dali, Boris Karloff, and Frank Sinatra. Wolverton submitted 7 cartoons, of which 1 ultimately took the top prize of $525, beating out such famous cartoonists as Carl Barks. The image was first published in the real Life magazine in 1946, so featuring Wolverton's drawing of Beautiful Girl of the Month, Reads Mad, is rendered more humorous for his history with the magazine. And hilariously, Mad had the audacity to insinuate that Life magazine was the ripoff on the inside cover of the issue. On the newsstands, we see actual knockoffs of Mad, which came out in the wake of its popularity. Crazy, Get Lost, and EC's own Mad knockoff, Panic. The contrast between the titles in the first and second panels show that when Crumb says that Mad made a deep impression, he's not only talking about on himself. And in fact, there were so many imitators to Mad that Kurtzman famously made this comic, which appeared in Mad number 17, bemoaning the number of Lampoon comics on the market after Mad, cleverly integrating the names of many of them into the narration. Incidentally, if you're interested in reading those Mad mimics, you should track down a copy of The Sincerest Form of Parody, published by Fantagraphics in 2012. But many of these titles can be read online, all free and legal-like, and I'll link to some of those in the show description as well. Next we see Crumb, now a regular Mad reader, but only in the store. As we can see, the clerk is kicking him, saying, "Hey, you gonna buy that funny book?" And the narration says that bringing them home was unthinkable. And this is further elaborated upon in an interview in the Book of Weirdo, where Crumb says that Mad had too much sexy stuff in it, and his mother wouldn't allow it in the house. We know that he's 11 in this panel because the cover is Mad number 19, which is based off of the Green Sheet, a kind of horse race betting newspaper. This is the best image I could find of a real issue of the Green Sheet. Sorry. Also, he mentions Mickey Rodent, which actually is in Mad number 19. The comics in the background now just read Abysmal Comics, symbolizing that Mad had become the only comic that mattered to Crumb at the time. In the next panel, he tells us that he lost track of Mad once it became a magazine, which began with issue number 24 in 1955, with its iconic filigreed borders, a staple of magazine publishing in the 19th and early 20th century, but ironic kitsch by the mid-century. Some version of these borders would appear on the cover of Mad until issue number 30, and they would also be adopted by some of Mad's competitors, who now began to imitate Mad in its magazine form. I'll link to a couple of those as well, but if you're interested, I strongly recommend Behaving Madly from Yo Books from 2017. And though he'd had two earlier appearances on Mad covers, Ballantyne's The Mad Reader paperback and Mad number 21, this issue marks the official mascotification of Alfred E. Newman under the alias Melvin Kosnowski. The character appeared prominently at the top of the cover, accompanied by his trademark catchphrase, "What, me worry?" Kurtzman didn't create the me worry kid. It was just kind of an analog meme going back to the 19th century. Probably a racist caricature of the Irish, like the Yellow Kid. Kurtzman had seen it on a postcard, and he took it as an icon of the Mad magazine ethos. Crumb would pay homage to the early Mad magazine on the cover of his own magazine, Weirdo, in the 1980s, implementing similar filigreed borders and mascot Etawain Shridloo, who would appear on many issues in the same prominent spot as Alfred. Etawain had a similar cultural meme-type origin, being named after a nonsense phrase that would appear accidentally on old hot-type newspapers, as well as being a play on Kilroy, the World War II meme that you still see from time to time today. Depending on who you ask, EC publisher Bill Gaines switched Mad from a comic book to a slick magazine in 1955, either to keep Kurtzman from taking a job offer at Pageant magazine, or simply as a way to bypass regulation from the incoming Comics Code Authority. Harvey had wanted to turn Mad into a magazine, which Gaines had previously refused due to increased production costs. But Gaines really did need Mad to continue publishing for the company to stay in business, since most of EC's popular titles were effectively being banned under the industry-imposed Comics Code Authority, which came about in response to a moral panic over comic books, and which seemed specifically targeted at his company. Mad was EC's best chance at survival. If you look at EC's other humor title at the time, Panic, Mad number 23 and Panic number 8 came out in May of 1955, still as comics, but with no Comics Code Authority seal. At the time, Mad was monthly and Panic was bi-monthly. Then, Mad number 24 skips June, comes out as a bi-monthly magazine in July, while Panic number 9 stays a comic book, releasing at the same time with the Comics Code Authority seal. But it only lasts 2 more issues before Gaines stopped publishing comic books altogether. So, I'm inclined to believe that the impetus for the change was a bit of both, like maybe Gaines would have let Harvey walk if he could have kept successfully publishing his horror comics. Or maybe he would have gone to a magazine format anyway without Kurtzman once the Comics Code Authority came into play, because it just made sense at that point. And he did try it with his Picto-Fiction magazine line. And it's not like he needed Kurtzman to publish Mad, evidenced by the fact that he did continue to publish Mad when Kurtzman left after issue number 28 to make the ultra-slick humor mag Trump for Playboy magazine publisher Hugh Hefner, a publication that crashed and burned after only 2 issues, in part because of the lavish production values, such as Will Elder's fold-out Life magazine Epic of Man parody, which posited how archaeologists a million years in the future will misinterpret modern artifacts, or Wally Wood's Disney parody drawn using actual animation cell shading techniques. As Hugh Hefner remarked, "I gave Harvey an unlimited budget, and he exceeded it." Afterwards, Kurtzman, and most of the other artists from Trump, pooled their resources to start the creator-owned magazine Humbug, a smaller and less slick publication than Trump, or even Mad for that matter, but which featured unparalleled writing and artwork due to that perfect combination of personal investment, genius, and desperation. I'll link to issues of both magazines, but I recommend picking up Trump, the Complete Collection, by Kitchen Sink and Dark Horse in 2016 while it's still widely available. The Complete Humbug, which was put out by Fantagraphics in 2008, is becoming more and more expensive on the secondary market. Humbug is a publication we see a 13-year-old Bobby Crumb spotting on the magazine rack, elevated from the other funny books. Notice the Alfred E. Newman-like missing tooth, which we'll cover in some distant future episode. Crumb describes Humbug as the heaviest cultural artifact I had ever seen. I was sent. From that moment, Crumb became a rabid fan of Kurtzman. He was in love, living, breathing, and eating the pages of his magazines. And we see him marveling at the pages of one of Harvey's mags, as he floats along in a very typical Kurtzman pose. Crumb then reprises his child pastime of looking for stuff in the trash, specifically old issues from 55 and 56. The speech balloon says, "Oh, I must have Mads number 24, 26, 27, and 28, which is all of the Kurtzman-helmed magazine issues of Mad, except for number 25, which suggests that was the only one that he owned at the time. This obsession permeated his dreams with imaginary issues of Mad that were missing from his collection. Now 15, Crumb agonizes over his developing art skills, attempting to draw like Mad and Humbug artists, and to write like Harvey Kurtzman, while becoming frustrated and discouraged by his inability to do either as well as them. And we can actually see Robert and his brother Charles's attempts at replicating that Mad look with their homemade zine, Foo, from this period in 1958. Several years pass, and Crumb sends a letter in some of his Fritz the Cat comics to Help Magazine, Harvey's follow-up to Humbug. His letter, apparently, was published in issue number 17 of Help in 1963, though I couldn't find a copy in order to see the letter. And he also received an encouraging response in return from Kurtzman himself. According to the R.Crumb coffee table art book, it read, "We really liked the cat cartoon, but we're not sure how we can print it and stay out of jail." In the summer of 1964, Crumb actually went to New York City to work as assistant to the assistant editor of Help magazine, Terry Gilliam, who would later go on to Monty Python, famously creating their wacky animated segments. Crumb depicts himself as blushing like a schoolgirl while working at Help, with Harvey handing him a folio saying, "Crumb, you nutcase, can you run this over to Harry Chester for me?" Harry Chester was a designer on Help, and probably best remembered for his iconic typography from campy monster magazines. Apparently there was a picture from the Help offices featuring Crumb at work, published in an issue of Business Week from this period, but I was unable to find a copy, so Here's a young Robert Crumb looking quite cool in a cameo from one of Help's fumetti photo comics. Something Crumb would also be inspired to make in the pages of Weirdo magazine 2 decades later. Harvey was a mentor to Crumb during this period, not only giving him advice about cartooning and commercial art, but also about coping with life in general. I think it's touching that the image Crumb uses for this scene is Harvey calling him a schmuck and saying, "How goyish can you get?" as Crumb nearly puts mayo on a corned beef sandwich. And it kind of positions Kurtzman as a bit of a father figure to Crumb, which is probably not far from the truth, given Crumb's strained relationship with his own father, which I cover in episode number 7, White Man, a story of civilization in crisis. In the January of 1965 issue of Help, Kurtzman finally figures out how to publish that Fritz the Cat comic, Fritz Comes On Strong, by changing the last 6 panels to be less overtly sexual. This was Crumb's first commercially published comic. This was followed that same year by 2 sketchbook profiles, one from Harlem and one from Bulgaria, where the newlywed Robert and Dana Crumb took a detour from their honeymoon on assignment for Help. And a second Fritz the Cat strip called Fred, the Teenage Girl Pigeon, graced the pages of Help as well. A few months later, Crumb moved back to New York City to take over from Gilliam as assistant editor on Help, only to arrive on the very day the magazine folded and the copper wiring was being stripped out of the walls. Harvey felt bad for Crumb and tried to get him various New York gigs, including a failed attempt at assisting Jack Davis on storyboards for commercials, before offering him a job coloring backgrounds on his comic, Little Annie Fanny. But after struggling with watercolors for a week, Harvey politely suggested Crumb might be happier doing his own thing. Little Annie Fanny was the lush and cheeky comic series by Kurtzman and longtime contributor Will Elder, which ran monthly in Playboy from 1962 all the way until 1988. It was also contributed to by many other famous cartoonists, including Al Jaffe, Jack Davis, and Frank Frazetta, to name a few. Every page is an absolute marvel to behold. It was meticulously laid out by Kurtzman on different layers of drafting vellum before the final artwork was completed. But it was a compromised work that took a serious toll on Kurtzman's mental health. According to Crumb, Kurtzman ended up being ground up by Hugh Hefner. It was a terrible, tragic thing to witness. He'd become an alcoholic, and he just broke down weeping over the way Hefner was constantly butchering his Annie Fanny stories. But it was a secure gig, and he needed the money to support his family. Crumb finishes Ode to Harvey Kurtzman by saying that even though he's made a name in his own right, he still feels like a worshipful fanboy in Harvey's presence, and he draws himself kissing a vexed Kurtzman on top of his bald head, saying, "Harvey, you saved my fucking life, man," which is an attitude felt towards Kurtzman by many underground cartoonists. For example, Crumb's fellow Help magazine and Zap Comics contributor Gilbert Shelton, whose famous characters, the Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers, he would draw alongside Angel Food McSpade and Mr. Natural on an underground newspaper within a Little Annie Fanny comic published in the July 1970 issue of Playboy magazine. Another underground Kurtzhead was Jay Lynch, whose characters, Nard and Pat, would be caricatured by Kurtzman himself in this canonical jam page from Nard and Pat number 1, which is reprinted in the Complete Crumb number 10. Kurtzman's own hand can also be seen in 3 other canonical jam pages: The End Funnies with Shelton and Crumb, Come the Revolution with Shelton and Crumb, along with Kim Deitch, Spain Rodriguez, Ralph Reese, and Alan Schenker under his nom de plume Yossarian, and Science Fiction Comics with Crumb, Shelton, and Spain, along with Robert Williams, Victor Moscoso, and S. Clay Wilson. All 3 comics of which were published in the East Village Other in 1969 and 1970. Kurtzman himself was an early appreciator of the underground comics movement as well. He even named his book about comics history From Arg to Zap. And he did the cover for the seminal Bijou Funnies #8 in 1973, often cited as marking the end of the golden era of underground comics, and which saw some of the biggest names on the scene doing full-color, mad-style parodies of each other's characters, including, amongst others, Jay Lynch doing those Verschluggener Fuzzy Geek Brothers, a send-up of Gilbert Shelton's Freak Brothers, which also featured cameos by Mr. Natural and the Snoid. Skip Williamson satirizing Mr. Natural and Flaky Foont as Melvin Natural and Funky Feet. Crumb unrecognizably ghosting Nard and Pat as Pard and Nat under the name RCrumb, which is reprinted in the Complete Crumb #9. And of course, Ralph Reese's send-up of Kurtzman's own Mad Imitators strip, which we looked at earlier, using the titles of popular underground comics of the day. Kurtzman made one other foray into the underground with his 1976 comic book, Kurtzman Comics, which was published by Kitchen Sink and featured an introduction by R.Crumb, the logo for which canonically appears in the Complete Crumb Volume 11, though this book is pretty much just reprints of Kurtzman's earlier pre-underground work. And I think that covers all of the canonical appearances of Kurtzman, but we still have 2 panels left in Ode to Harvey Kurtzman, which act as a sort of epilogue. It's now 1989, and little Bobby Crumb is 46 years old, though he looks like the elderly captain from Mad's Ping Pong. He says he was invited by Harvey to illustrate one of the stories for a book Price Publications was doing, that's Byron Price, Visual Publications Inc., and that he was thrilled to work from Harvey's great pencil layouts, like Elder, Wood, and Davis from the original Mad comic book. But mirroring the 2 panels from when he was 15, the comic ends with Crumb tearing up the pages and ranting, "I give up! I'll never be a pro!" The implication here is that Crumb, like the other artists in the Strange Adventures collection, was given a script, but that he couldn't hack working from Kurtzman's meticulous layouts. Not unlike his futile attempts at assisting Davis and Elder following the demise of Help, as Crumb recalls Kurtzman saying to him at the time, "Don't be an assistant to anybody. You're too eccentric and individualistic." I do wonder if Crumb's non-conforming pages were a concession of sorts. Often, when nerds knock this book, they make the caveat that Crumb's piece is the exception. So I guess it was a welcomed one. Of course, maybe another Kurtzman story instead of a 3rd introduction might have made the book a more coherent package. And the other comics in this book are all at least 5 pages long, so it's entirely possible those introduction pages were slapped together to fill a gap left by Crumb only submitting 2 pages. Who knows? Sadly, Kurtzman died due to complications from liver cancer less than 3 years after Ode to Harvey Kurtzman was published. He was only 68 years old at the time. Jules Feiffer said, "It was as if cartooning had lost its Orson Welles." At the time, I was 10 years old and only just discovering the genius of Harvey Kurtzman, and like Crumb, Harvey also made a deep impact on me, both directly through his work and vicariously through his creations like Mad Magazine, which carried on after his tenure, and through the influence that his work has had on other artists, as well as on the culture that I grew up in. Certainly, after Crumb, Kurtzman is the most represented artist in my collection, and I think at some point in the next year or so, I'd like to start a similar series to this one, dedicated to the comics and collaborations of Harvey Kurtzman. This episode has only just scratched the surface of his legacy, but for now, this marks the end of another episode of Canonically Crumb. If you enjoyed this program, make sure to hit like, hit subscribe, be a ding-dong daddy, and ding that bell. I'm your host, Kyle Bridgett. You can find my links in the show description, and also check out my new podcast, PODRZEBIE, the comic book nerdcast that dares to ask, What? Me worry? And if you want to support this program and myself, you will also find my Patreon and donation links in the show description as well. Canonically Crumb will be back as weekly as possible with another deep dive into the Crummy-verse. Thanks again, Crumbums, and keep right on.
I'm a sugar, I'm a sugar, I'm a sugar, about my sugar, I'm a sugar. He's crazy about me.